Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jermillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives of people in my network, friends, colleagues, partners in my network. I want to get to these great leads and hear from them about the books that have impacted them, the ones that have contributed the most to their work, their life, their personal life. There's so many lessons that transfer from the business and work world to the personal world. So there's just so much that people can take away from these books. In this series, the three categories of books I covered are ones that they're sharing with me, that they've read of another author that I've never covered, never read. Second category is a book that we've both read, whether specifically for the series or that we read in our previous lives. The third category is when I bring on authors and publishers to share the messages of the books that they've put out themselves. For this particular episode, I'm going to have an author, and my guest today is Sean Glaze. And Sean is an author and leadership expert who has worked with clients like the CDC, John Deere, Coca-Cola, and Emory University to increase collaboration, boost productivity, and build exceptional workplace cultures. Sean's engaging conference keynotes and interactive team building events help accelerate the growth of more effective leaders. As a successful basketball coach and educator for over 20 years, Sean gained valuable insights into leading winning teams and founded effective leaders to share those lessons. Sean's books, Rapid Teamwork, The 10 Commandments for Winning Teammates, and Staying Coachable, A Story with 4 Questions to Help You Thrive in Change and Enjoy Relentless Improvement, are entertaining parables with powerful takeaways to improve team performance and leadership. The question that Sean asks that gets to the core of what his work is what issues are you dealing with that would disappear if you had a workplace culture that emphasized connection, accountability, and a team-first attitude? I met Sean through just networking, kind of hearing podcasts that are out there. He was lucky enough to reach out with me to speak about his book. So we shared some ideas back and forth. He told me what he was about. I told him what I was about. And here we are for this great conversation. This is right up my alley, anything leadership, team building. So Sean, thank you so much for joining me.
Man, the guy you introduced sounds pretty impressive. I don't know if that's the guy that I see in the mirror when I'm brushing my teeth, John, but I really appreciate that introduction.
Isn't that amazing that, as you're going through life, it's so weird, but as you're going through life, it's one thing you're reacting to everything, Sean. But then when you look at your accomplishments, when you see it written down, when you see it or hear it read, that's the moment where you're like, oh, okay. Because the rest of the time, it just seems like we're in reactive mode, just trying to get through the day. We're being proactive and
Right.
doing our work. But it's something to really step back and hear it, especially when somebody else reads it, what you've achieved and how far you've come.
Well, and I think that that's something that as you get a little bit older, you gain some of that perspective, right? And you having been around a while, that idea of doing a little bit along the way. Once you kind of look back over a pretty longer way, you notice that you've accomplished and hopefully helped to impact a number of people, and that I know is what I'm proud of and looking forward to continuing to do, and why I'm really excited to be able to join you, because the impact that you have in sharing the books and the messages and the insights that you have on your program have been fantastic.
I appreciate that so much. So, Sean, obviously I read your bio, but who are you today? Can you provide a little more information about what the work that you do looks like? Not every day, but day to day. What does that look like with the people that you work with, the groups that you work with?
Yeah, well, like anybody else, the who I am today is really dependent on who I was over that kind of path of my past. And I, for nearly 30 years, John, was a high school literature teacher and basketball coach. It was as a basketball coach that I became familiar with the impact of culture on team performance, because as a young coach, I face planted and our team underperformed based upon the talent that we had. And I was really focused upon the strategy, the X's and O's, and all the stuff that you would think was supposed to be important as a young leader. And then came pretty quickly to realize that talent's essential, but it's never sufficient. And you need more than just talent and strategy. And that's where my real kind of dive into the impact on culture and connections and camaraderie, and that kind of team commitment and standards that you need to establish had an impact on the outcomes and results that ultimately the other programs and teams that I was able to lead enjoyed a great deal more success. And so taking that to what I'm doing today, is really transferring a lot of those same lessons and insights that help to improve our locker room and our team results and performance to where other leaders and other industries can use those same activities and same insights and that same basically template of what it is that builds an exceptional workplace culture to apply to their team. And so that, again, one of the things that I share a lot of times in events today is, you can be an emerging or an experienced leader and not necessarily be as effective as you want. Effectiveness is about awareness, and the books that I've written have hopefully helped to improve the awareness of leaders and teammates about the impact that they have.
And so, Sean, what do you offer in terms of your services? Is it mostly one-on-one? Obviously, you speak to teams, so that's big.
Mhm.
Obviously, I would assume teamwork as well, but is it mostly one-on-one? Is it, 50-50 one-on-one versus group coaching, group facilitation? What does that look like, the work itself?
Yeah, the work itself today is people will contact me, and again, you were great and mentioned my website, Great Results Team Building, because initially it was half and full day team building events that really had impact instead of it being something fluffy or recreational. What can we do that's going to really allow us to have deeper, more meaningful conversations and experiences that change behaviors and change culture? And so it was team building for nearly a decade before I began to do the conference keynoting and sharing some messages that are part of the books that I've published. And now I'll do a little bit of coaching for some of the executives or leaders that I work with from conferences or from those team building events that I do for organizations. But most of it has really been exactly that, a half or a full day team building that's going to hopefully have lasting impact and reinforcing that with some coaching and training afterwards, or a conference keynote to really help an organization or an association to focus upon some of the things that'll make them more successful with their teams.
Sean, to understand how you got to where you are now, and so far back doesn't necessarily follow to get you, or where you are now doesn't follow necessarily from where you started. But what is early on before you started your career? Maybe it was family, maybe it was schooling. What did that start with? What did that start the path towards your livelihood later? Was it going into college? Was it motivation by somebody in your family? What did that look like? The path that you took to get to now?
I uh, I think that I've always been, and again, you see behind yourself and behind me the books that have helped to grow who we are, right? And I think that you're going to be the same person you are 5 or 10 years from now, except for the people you meet in the books that you read, right? Because that's going to change your thoughts and your awareness and your beliefs. Beliefs change behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. And so, growing up in a family that wasn't financially affluent, I was very much ambitious to create more and have a different lifestyle than what I had kind of grown up with.
Mm.
And that led me to be the first person that kind of graduated from college in our family. And my love of education obviously led me to then be a teacher, which is certainly not the path to financial security, but
Yeah.
it is pretty consistent, and that gave us the foundation for building our family. And I was able to do some other things on the side that contributed. But I think that specifically what I do today in working with teams and leaders and organizations to help to develop them and make them more successful is the exact same thing that I did in classrooms and locker rooms. It's just in a different forum. And ultimately, I think that probably the reason that you started your podcast is for about the exact same purposes. What can I do first to grow myself so that ultimately I can grow and positively impact others?
Yeah. And just a quick side tangent. I had a comedian on, um, Greg Kettner, and I had written a blog post years ago, maybe 2019, um, how comedians and leadership, the underlying, like 10 underlying items that uh, take place in each of them. So I sent it to Greg. I'm like, okay, you're a comedian. Let me know what you think of this. Since you're a teacher, I had also written an article or a blog post a couple of years ago about how teachers were our first leadership coaches. Obviously, that me as a blue collar kid growing up, like most of my education, most of my life lessons were in the classroom. So for whatever reason, I was just inspired to write that blog post. So that's one. The same way I sent that one to Greg, I'll have to send this one to you that I'm mentioning,
I would
just
love to
because
see that.
just because I'm curious what you think.
Right. Well,
Uh,
and I think that absolutely, certainly our parents are teachers in terms of, behaviors and interactions, coaches and teachers in the same vein. And I think that oftentimes, whether it's parents or teachers or coaches, or ultimately later on the managers that we experience, are our teachers, in that we learn what we want to emulate, and we also learn what we don't want to emulate. Right. And so, sometimes you can have, and I think that we've all experienced in the past, a bad teacher or a bad coach who we learned a lot from because we
yes,
identified things that weren't going to be successful that we
pitfalls.
didn't want to repeat.
Yes. What did you go to school for, Sean?
I was at Georgia Southern University and majored in English because I was originally going to be an attorney, John. And
Okay.
when University of Georgia Law School did not accept me because I'd played a little bit too much as a freshman, I honestly fell into a teaching position. And by Thanksgiving of that first year as a teacher, I realized that's exactly where I was supposed to be. Sometimes Providence puts us where we both belong.
Yeah, it's amazing how those things work out. And then the other question I had is, how did you transition from teaching to coaching?
Yeah, well, that very first year, I was honestly excited about the teaching and learning, to become a teacher. Knowing the content, knowing how to teach and share and impact others with content is a very different experience. But I began the coaching journey because that very first year that I was teaching, my wife now was actually still in nursing school. So I had a year away and I was just looking to fill my days. So I actually ended up coaching 3 or 4 different sports, and it was cross country and it was basketball and then it was soccer, and even helped out with tennis because they needed that very first year. So I was crazy insane with a wild calendar, but fell in love with the competitiveness and the coaching and the teaching that basketball specifically demanded. And that's where I focused my efforts. And that ultimately is where I learned a lot of the lessons that I now share with teams and leaders about culture.
So then, how did you jump from education and sports coaching and education to what you're doing now? What was the trigger? What was the impetus? What was it that pushed you to step out and do this your own thing, write your books? What
Yeah,
was that?
the speaking and facilitating and writing was all as a result of the impact that I saw that culture and an emphasis on culture and connections had on our program. And I first realized, hey, if this is something that helped our team, it's going to be able to help other teams. And so the very first kind of stuff that I did was with university athletic programs, because that was, again, very closely related. Then I realized, well, hey, this is stuff that works not only in athletics, but probably professionally as well. What can I do? When my background is a teacher, so I started working with school faculties and doing pre-planning stuff to build some camaraderie and influence collaboration and trust on school faculties. And then had somebody invite me after that, hey, my husband has this business, can you work with him? And that kind of opened the door to realizing that the same issues that teams of athletes or teams of teachers or teams of salespeople or teams of nurses or teams of factory workers, regardless of industry, you're
Yes.
dealing with a lot of the same issues in terms of collaboration or trust or accountability, and those leadership practices that help to inspire those more effective and positive and profitable cultures are things I think that absolutely transcend industry lines.
Yeah, it's always funny when somebody is referred to me and we're doing like a consultation or
Mhm.
a discovery call, and they're curious. They're like, "So which industry do you work in?" And the great thing about the work that we do is like there is no limit. Like you can use it like in the household, you can use it in a factory, you can use it in an office building, you can use it, as you've said, like in hospitals and medical institutions. So I love the fact that it really is boundless. I mean,
Right.
I find myself even having conversations that I would have with a client with more care, more love with my kid, with my child,
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
asking questions, like getting him to think, not always providing him the answer. But and I never had that with my father and my parents because they were blue collar workers from a different country. So there was like a culture barrier, there was like a
Mhm.
language barrier. It was just very not confusing, but it just wasn't the same. So I feel I'm blessed that I'm able to kind of just have that understanding of a coach while I have those conversations with him. He's the oldest. He's 8. He's going to
Mhm.
be 8. The other ones are younger, but even with the younger ones, I've always said what's great about leadership coaching is you can do it from whatever age to whatever age, whatever
Mhm.
range. But obviously it's the vernacular you use, the language
Well,
that you use. You know what I mean? So I appreciate the fact that I can use that with my kids, bring it down to their level, but still kind of hold them accountable, ask them questions. It's such a blessing.
Well, that's one of the things that's most, I guess, surprised me is the number of different industries and organizations that have reached out to me that I've had the benefit and pleasure of working with, because as you mentioned, leadership principles aren't key to just one area. You can apply the same principles, whether it's athletics, whether it's basketball or business, whether it's nursing or tech. It's the same type of leadership principles. You can be a great teammate, whether it's as an athlete or as a coworker, and those same principles apply. And specifically to what the work that you do and I do at times with my clients is in terms of coaching, those coaching questions and helping people to improve their awareness by having those conversations that lead to the insights that they can then apply and move forward with. Those are things that aren't necessarily key to just one industry or just one specific type of career. It's something that transcends those. And that's why I think that the book, and again, the book Staying Coachable has done quite well and gotten the response that it has in terms of the conference keynotes and some of the trainings that I've shared is, a lot of people and executives have a coach. Not everybody stays coachable.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll get into the book because I love that title, Staying Coachable. Before we do though, one thing I
Mhm.
always ask my guests is I'm curious now that we've kind of walked through quickly your life and your work. Does it make sense, even though it was kind of like this kind of path? Does it make sense if you look back at your childhood that you're doing what you're doing now?
I think a lot of times in retrospect, you can probably say, hey, that had this influence. But I think that anything else, that our trajectory is based upon decisions we made in specific circumstances. And the same person you can have, again, with your kids, you're going to see, and I've got a little bit older children, same household, same culture, same parents, three very different lifestyles and careers and perspectives, because people individually will react to the same impetus or the same situation or the same circumstances or the same information differently based upon maybe what they notice in the midst of that experience. And so, yeah, I think absolutely as we look back, we begin to realize how that experience kind of led us down a different path. But I think that that's also something that is interestingly individualized based upon what we choose to do in response to circumstances.
Thank you. And then what does leadership mean to you? I'm always curious to find out how people put it in their own words. What does it mean to you, Sean? Excuse me.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that. One of the things that I'll do when I'm working with an organization or a group of leaders or a team is to define some terms. And one of those is culture. Culture is just the behaviors that are repeated in an organization. And so our job is to improve the behaviors by improving your beliefs and awareness based upon some shared experiences we're going to go through. Specifically, though, in terms of leadership, I love the idea that leadership is the influence that our interactions have on others. And that can be, something that I say, something that I do, something that I implement or process. But that idea of the interactions that we have with others ultimately influence them, and that creates the leadership. And you can have positive leadership and you can have negative leadership. And there were in my locker rooms, just like there are in office buildings across the nation, there are individuals who are going to have a positive impact on coworkers because of the influence of their interactions and lead positively. And there are those that may not provide the best examples or have the best interactions. And ultimately, you want a team of people who are emulating hopefully the leadership influence and having more productive interactions because they're more intentional about them.
Sean, you don't have to name names, but who has been one of the best leaders that you've worked with? What kind of environment did they set? What kind of personality did they have? How did they empower you? What was it that made them stand out?
What's interesting when I go into an organization or into a new industry is whether it's, technology or manufacturing or medical or whatever that is, I've noticed that the most successful and impactful and memorable leaders share a lot of those same traits that great teammates might. And so the leaders that I had as a young teacher and coach, I remember one coach in particular who just recently passed away because of COVID. His name is Tony Engel. He won a Division II championship at Kennesaw State. I was fortunate enough to meet and become really good friends with him. We'd have breakfast together. But his encouragement, or certainly his faith, the fact that he loved the people that he coached and made sure that they understood that concern and care was the priority, and that the coaching and improvement in basketball was something, I think for him, like a lot of coaches, basketball was a tool to have a greater impact on people. And I think that the principals that I worked with in terms of the schools that I taught at shared many of those same traits in terms of, some of the least effective and impressive principals were those that lived behind their desk and weren't out and, interacting with and on the front lines and having conversations and sharing, whether it was enthusiasm or encouragement or empathy with the people that they're leading. And I think that those are things that you see across industry lines, again, as defining great leadership.
Great examples. Thank you. Now, Sean, we can jump into the book now. Can you tell us a little bit about the book? How did this book come to be? And I mean, you can also, I think you wanted to do a deeper dive into Staying Coachable, but you can also reference the other book as well, just to kind of get you an idea to learn from what it was that led to them.
As we've discussed, and I appreciate you going into some background early on, because it'll help our listeners and viewers for this episode specifically, is my journey was really first, how can I help leaders be better? And then how can I help the people who are on teams and coworkers be better teammates and recognize the impact of their attitude and actions? And then whether it's helping leaders turn individuals into teams or helping individuals be better teammates. And that was, shameless plug, that was first Rapid Teamwork, and then it was the 10 Commandments of Winning Teammates. What I found was, both as a coach and as a leader speaking with and coaching other leaders, the people that we work with and are hoping to help improve don't always appreciate or apply the advice that we share. And I know that you've experienced that. Even when you're hired as a coach, you have this great conversation, there's this great insight, and you set the commitment, here's the accountability, and I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. And they come back, and how did that go? Well, here's what happened. And you get the excuse, or you get here's the other things where I didn't necessarily make the commitment to apply and appreciate, to be greedy and grateful to move forward with these actions. And so the idea of being coached versus being coachable are two very, very different things. And I had, as athletes in our program, players and individuals who could have been better shooters, who could have been better defenders, that when you took the time to invest and to pour into them, they were a full cup, right? And they didn't necessarily want any other fluid kind of corrupting what they had already accepted as their reality. And I, for well over a decade as a young coach, had unsuccessfully done what I think a lot of leaders do, which is you continue to command and control and to demand, and you teach and you push. But if somebody's not willing to be open, then that's only going to cause resentment and other things that aren't going to necessarily be as profitable behaviors as you would like. And so what I began to see as I began to coach people outside of just basketball is that idea of just sharing unsolicited advice and just giving directions or information and demands is not necessarily the most effective way to go about leading. And it was, again, Bob T does a great job in terms of his, blog, Leading with Questions, and have shared a number of conversations with him. And he's got obviously books along that same line. But if you lead with questions, you have so much more impact on not just people's willingness to be thoughtful, but that then leads to them internally, hopefully beginning to recognize the gap between where they want to be and where they presently are. And when I got better at asking questions and building connections and being curious, my players surprisingly got better at being greedy and grateful for the information that I could share.
What do you think that is on their side? What is it that they're taking away? Why is it that they take it away so easily? Is it the empowerment that the question? Yeah, I'm assuming it is the empowerment. They just it's it's always interesting when somebody asks you your take,
Mhm.
especially a younger person when they get questions. It's like, oh, okay, what I have to say matters. So let me step into that a little bit. Is that what you think it was for them when you would ask questions and then see better performance?
Where when I didn't see the appreciation or application of the ideas that could have helped them improve, it was when I was pushing something onto them and suggesting that they weren't good enough in that
Mm,
moment, or that there was something broken or wrong about that behavior that needs to change. And so people will sometimes resist when you're trying to push them, right?
yeah.
And that idea of, it's not my job to push, I want you to want to pull yourself in a direction. How can I be a resource and a guide and encourager to equip you with the tools and awareness and insight that's going to make you better when you give that effort? Because as a coach, I can't get on the court. It's about me making my people better and them being able to depend upon themselves. And I think that everybody craves autonomy, whether it's a
Mm.
teacher or an athlete or a coworker or a leader or a manager in your organization. We want it to be our idea. We want to all feel that we're smart and capable and good. And yet sometimes our leaders and coworkers will bombard us with things we need to do differently, and we end up feeling attacked instead of empowered. And I think that that idea of using questions to create that sense of there being a gap. And again, the Staying Coachable book is all about, even in the midst of that kind of parable that I use in my books, it's all about what are the questions that lead people down a path where they're the ones making the commitment instead of being complacent.
Yeah, and it's great that your players saw that fashion of leadership, asking questions, because they're gonna at first they're gonna mimic what they see until it's naturally flowing out of them. But it's great that they saw so early the power of questions instead of like the stick and carrot kind of thing.
Well,
So I think that's a huge part of your legacy is what you've left with them and that ability to see the power of questions.
I can tell you, and I'm sure that a number of the listeners will identify with the fact that I really regret the coach I was for the first decade or so of my career, because I wasn't as good in the classroom. I wasn't as good in the locker room as obviously I became. And so if you had asked somebody from the first 5 years of my leadership, what their experience was like versus somebody from the last few years, I think that they probably had very different experiences with me. And that's, I think, part of our job as leaders, and why I am a reader, why you're a reader, why people that listen to this show want to find books that are going to help them to be better. Because ultimately, my responsibility is to be as good as I can so I can help to develop and inspire and equip others.
Sean, what was your turning point? When you say the first 5 years, what was it that happened, or who
I
came
think
across your path, or what was that sign that, okay, I got to change my ways?
I think that failure is one heck of a catalyst for change. And when you're ambitious and you realize I want better than this, and if our team is going to change, if our program is going to change, then I need to be the one who changes first. I think that's that kind of mirror moment is the starting point for any leader to realize that if my team's going to be better, I've got to first be better. That and a whole lot of the idea of staying coachable is realizing that I can't change somebody else's behavior, but I can change how I interact with them.
Mhm.
And rather than that command and control that's going to be oftentimes resisted, if I can be connected, if I can be curious and ask the right questions in the right way and order, that's going to lead them down a path that's going to hopefully inspire within them that desire to seek more and be better themselves.
Sean, before we dive in into this book and staying coachable, into what made you write it, what it's structured like,
Mhm.
how it flows, can you just give a brief breakdown of each of your other books, just to kind of just the impetus for what made you write it, what people can find in it, and then From there, we can jump into.
Well,
I think you had the original 2 books and then Staying Coachable, correct?
yes, specifically for leaders, those are the 3 books that are most relevant. And Rapid Teamwork was the very first book that I wrote when I decided to do some of the conference keynoting and to share messages that people could implement with their teams and organization. And ultimately, there's a huge difference between a group of individuals and a team who's really committed and pulling in the same direction and aligned with a purpose and relationships and expectations and accountability and appreciation. So I use the acronym GREAT in the Rapid Teamwork about how do you build a great team. Well, these are the 5 elements of an exceptional team culture. And oftentimes if there's a problem on the team, it's because I've neglected one of those 5 areas. And so Rapid Teamwork is basically a story that shares, here are the things that if you are intentional about a leader that you can focus on to build and sustain an exceptional team culture. And then I realized as I got, calls and had conversations about conferences that, not everybody there at the conference is always going to be in a leadership or management position. What can we do with our frontline people? And I had obviously all kinds of experience helping teammates be better and recognizing how they as an individual, their attitude and their actions impacted others. And that obviously led to the 10 commandments of winning teammates, as I began to notice, not just with the athletes I had over the last decade of my coaching career, but with a number of the individuals that I spoke with and did surveys with for the events that I facilitated or spoke at, that there were the same basic 10 different categories of behaviors that great teammates would focus on. And they're all going to share appreciation. They're going to take personal responsibility for team results. They're going to care about and encourage others. They're going to make sure that they respect the clock and the calendar. And so that list of kind of 10 commandments of winning teammates provided the basis for the story that then carries that content and ends up being kind of something that, if I'm a great coworker, these are the things that I want to do, because ultimately these are the things that I want my teammates to do as well. And then the last book, the one that came out just around the time that COVID started, honestly, was the Staying Coachable. And Staying Coachable was particularly relevant, not just to a couple of the players that I had, but because hopefully, again, I had begun to learn and apply the lessons that I had learned as a leader. And again, anytime you learn something that helps you, I think our job as leaders and teammates and parents and friends is to hopefully in some way share that with others so they don't step in the same potholes that kept us from being more successful earlier ourselves.
Yeah. So how do you break out Staying Coachable? What does the book look like? What's the journey that you take the reader on through that book, Sean?
Yeah, the story, and again, each of my books is a parable. And so it starts off, you've got a father and son who are at Mount Zion National Park. They're walking through the Narrows and they meet somebody, and that somebody ends up being the wise guy that's able to first connect with them and learn some of their circumstances, and that the son is frustrated with this circumstance and the father is frustrated with that circumstance at work, and that they're both basically annoyed but not being coachable. And so whether it's in a situation as an athlete, as a younger person, or whether it's a situation as an experienced coworker in an organization professionally, you are where you are. You and I individually, and every person listening or watching, you are where you are. You've reached your level of expertise and success because you were coachable. We've all been coachable in the past. The problem is at some point we become complacent. And once we reach that plateau, we convince ourselves that we're good enough or that we're okay and we don't need to continue to improve or get better or change. And I think that sense of unwillingness to change or to appreciate new information and new opportunities to grow and develop ourselves is where oftentimes people get stuck. And so what she shares over the course of a number of letters through the story in the book are some questions for the father and son to consider that then eventually lead them to have far better results, and then ultimately to at the end of the story to kind of be able to influence others themselves.
Yeah, I love the fact that you include a father and son as the ones that kind of have to learn the lessons. Because in the conversations that I've had with the specialists that I've had here, my guests, I'm always curious about what they're doing with their clients typically adults, but I'm always curious about what we can do to prepare the next generations, the younger generations in that same fashion. So I love the fact that you have a father and a son because you have those two perspectives. You have
Mhm.
somebody that's lived a fuller life than how young is the son in the story?
The son is a senior in high school. The father obviously is somebody who's been in that professional position for a number of years and has reached that plateau of complacency and is not willing to adopt the next platform or the new process that a merger is kind of implemented. And so I think that that's a pretty common and relevant circumstance that people sometimes find themselves in is I've reached this level of success and I've become comfortable, and sometimes that ends up you know
It's a blind spot.
keeping me from being as good as I, because you don't have to be sick to get better, right? And so that idea of, what can you share as examples for either of those circumstances where they can then begin to see, because ultimately, whether you're an emerging leader or an established leader, you become more effective when you have those moments of awareness. And so that's basically what the story is about, is providing questions that allow them. This is what you do in your practice, right? You provide questions and have conversations that allow the individuals you work with when we're coaching people to have those aha moments and insights that then they can apply. And they're far more committed to applying their ideas than they sometimes are ours.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it, especially because you have the 2 generations. It's not just the older generation, it's not just the younger generation, but it's both of them combined, and they can kinda bounce each other ideas off each other, examples off each other. They're going through different experiences, they're at different points in their lives, so I think that's incredibly valuable. Sean, how did you decide to, write your books in parable form?
I have,
And believe me, I understand the
yeah,
power of story, but to commit your books in that fashion, what was it that drove that?
probably a couple of things. Honestly, John, the first is my background as an English teacher. There's always that little bit of you that wants to be able to pen a story that's going to be entertaining and engaging. And then when you have the content that is going to be helpful for others, then the challenge becomes, how do I craft a story that's going to be an engaging enough story and entertaining and be able to carry, and then also weave in the content that people can highlight and apply and pause to think about, how does this end up being implementable for us and our team and me specifically. And so that's one of the things I think that for each of the books, then in taking the time to write and edit it and rewrite and kind of go back and get the feedback from family members and friends that I've been relatively successful with. And so the idea of story, having been an English teacher and appreciating literature for decades, is a huge part of that. The other is, somebody like a Bob Berg or a John Gordon. I think that their books are uh, great airport reads, and so none of my books are over 160, 165 pages, because I believe that if you can entertain somebody for 2 or 3 hours and give them something they can go back to and see, here's where I highlighted, here's where I folded the dog ear page, because I want to make sure that this is something I share with my team. Then it's not just entertaining, then it's something that's implementable, that has impact.
And Sean, you don't have to give away the store, but can you give some examples of the questions that you outline or lay out for the reader in the story of Staying Coachable?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, the story, I think, does carry the questions, but in the midst of the story and the correspondence between uh, the kind of guiding, wiser uh, individual and the father and the son, basically there's 4 different steps to staying coachable, 4 questions that allow you to thrive and change and continue to improve. And the first question is, where do you want to be? What do you want to accomplish? Because ultimately, the very first question you have when somebody contacts you as a coach is, okay, what is it you're wanting to accomplish? Because if we don't have that, then we can just wander around and we'll be successful, because we've not identified that destination. And so I can have that exact same conversation with a point guard on my team a decade ago. Hey, where do you want to be? Where do you want this to take you? What is the impact you want to have? What is your destination ultimately? And I can have the exact same conversation with a manager at a manufacturing facility, what is it you want to accomplish from our conversations? And so that first idea of what you want to accomplish and where you want to be, what's the mountain that you want to climb and ascend to, is the most important, because there needs to be that purpose.
It's amazing how often people don't consider that.
Yeah. Well, here's my process. This is what I want to do. Let's jump into it, instead of giving them the reason to jump into it.
Yeah. Because I think most people, even the professionals that I work with, have kind of sacrificed what they wanted, the passion they had, the values they could bring to the table, to fall in line with the script, if you will, of society, of that industry, of that company. Like, this is your path. Do your work and you'll move up here. Do your work and you'll move up there. So I find that so many people that I work with, again, that question you posed, it's so simple. It sounds so common sense, but it's not commonly practiced. That consideration for yourself of, where do I really want to be? Even if this is my career path, even if I do keep working another 3 years and that's the promotion, is that going to make me fulfilled? So that's, again, sounds basic, but it's such a powerful self-assessment question.
Yeah. And I think that, hopefully we direct our steps based upon the destination that we've identified. And I think that you are absolutely right. A lot of times we get comfortable in a circumstance, or we get comfortable with an income that is secured. And so we don't necessarily weigh the cost of walking in a different direction than ultimately we might have appreciated more. So yeah, that idea of hunger is the first step in staying coachable. The second is honesty. And so if hunger is the first thing to focus on, the second is honesty. And that obviously is, what are your numbers? Where are you now? And numbers don't lie. And invariably I would bring in say an athlete when I was coaching basketball, John, and they want to be, they want more playing time. They want to have a chance to be recruited. And so, as a guard, they need to be able to shoot the ball relatively well. And if you got a 19% 3-point percentage, that's not very high. You want to be 35 or 40%. So if here's what you want to do, well, let's look at your numbers.
Yes.
This is something that ends up screaming that there's a gap. And I think that those first two questions, where do I want to be and where am I now, as simple as they are, to be brutally honest with yourself and to look at your numbers without making excuses, to look at your circumstance without pointing your finger somewhere else, and to take ownership of your present situation. Because I can't chart out on a map how I'm going to get somewhere until I'm really honest about where I'm at and where I'm starting.
Yeah. You have to be honest about your foundation, or you're just building off of like sand. Is the way I always look at it. It has to be solid, not perfect. You can keep refining it, but you really have to be honest with yourself.
And you can only improve something that you're willing to acknowledge. So whether it's as a leader or as a teammate, I'm not going to be better at giving feedback until I admit to me, listen, I've not done a great job of providing you guys with feedback. I want to make sure that I'm getting better. I'm going to ask for you guys to help me as I try and implement some things that gives us a chance to be better together, because I want to improve for you. And I think that sense of acknowledging the reality is that first step in eventually being able to close the gap. But here's what I found, and this is where I think that that staying coachable really becomes, a repeatable kind of message and process is, there needs to be the hunger for a destination. And there needs to be the honesty of, where am I at now in terms of numbers or your current skills or whatever that might be defined as. But when you've defined those two and you've taken the time to really be thoughtful about answering those two questions, there is always invariably a gap. And it's that gap that creates the desire in the people that you work with, the people that you're coaching, to then seek outside help. Because if this is where I'm at and that's where I want to be, I've probably accomplished and implemented everything that I can according to my background knowledge and the skills that I presently have. And it takes demonstrating that gap for people to then look outside themselves and ask that next question, which is, what weakness do I need to admit? What mentor can I find to then help to close that gap? And that's when people really become coachable, is when they notice the gap between those two things that are the first two important questions.
Yeah. It's what blows me away about coaching is just for everything that we were taught coming up in education. Yeah, we were never taught to assess ourselves in that way. I think things are changing. I think
Mhm.
schools are more cognizant. It was a different world. I mean, when you were going to school, I was going to school, maybe a different world. Um, but it's amazing how simple it can be just to self-assess, to really ask yourself questions. And I like the fact that it is catching traction. It
Mhm.
is becoming more important to stop and reflect on what you're doing, what you want, and going for it.
Well, I think that we can only give people what's already in our backpack. And a lot of times, teachers or leaders may not have that awareness themselves. And so they can only kind of give what they
Yeah.
bring. And I think that we are, as a society, hopefully more and more aware of the importance of reflection, the importance of feedback, the importance of curiosity over command and control. And those are things that you begin to see, for all the negative. If you want to look into, the media, or you can always find negative if you're looking, but you can also find a whole huge heap and helping of positive, where things are far, far better today than they were in the workplace and in families and society, because I think there is an increase in the awareness of things that you're talking about.
Sean, what did you see? How did your work change? What did you see change in your clients during the pandemic when the pandemic hit?
Wow. Well, as a speaker and facilitator, obviously that was a pretty huge hit, and I had a number of friends who struggled mightily, honestly, because when you go from having, and this was never my experience, but when you had, say, 40 or 50 events a year down to zero, they financially were hit pretty hard. And there were a number of speakers I know from the organization, National Speakers Association here in Georgia, I know ended up having to find something else or leave the profession as a speaker, because that was an extended time where, if they didn't get familiar with virtual presentation or with Zoom, or set up a kind of an office where they could do coaching, or they could have conversations or do a virtual keynote or facilitate things virtually, then it became really difficult. I do believe that one of the great things to come out of COVID is that people are more comfortable with remote and hybrid situations, that you can establish intentional connections with conversations like we're having, when you're not just going through content, but you really are intentional about connecting and being
Mhm.
curious about your people and checking in on them. And that you can accomplish a lot in terms of training and impact and influence and awareness through keynotes that don't necessarily have to be in person. Now, that said, I love in-person events. I love the fact that 90% of what I do now is back to in person, because there is an energy in a room that you don't get necessarily if you've got
Yeah.
the Zoom or the WebEx or the Blue Jeans or whatever platform, like Teams. But yeah, that's something that I think, as a speaker and facilitator, it does make you, like anything else. If everything that you took for granted was taken away, what would you be left with? I think sometimes when things are taken away, we learn to appreciate them that much more. And when
Absolutely.
organizations have had a chance to come back and have in-person conferences and do retreats or trainings to bring their people in who haven't met, because 30% of new hires maybe have been remote, and now you're bringing them together for an annual or a quarterly retreat of some kind. It's such a different feel for them to be able to have that connection with and build relationships with and establish a familiarity with people who they had only known virtually.
Yeah. Sean, what in writing this book, yeah, we can go into this book first, and then I'm
Mhm.
curious with your previous books. In writing this book, what lessons did you take away in writing it? People have answered that in terms of their writing style, how they
Mhm.
became disciplined in writing. That's obviously a direction we can go in, but I'm always curious how, knowing what you want to write, this is the plan, this is what I'd like to do, how
Mhm.
that evolves over the course of writing it and how it may have changed you writing this book. So what was your lesson? What was your major change, if any, during
Yeah,
the course
I
of
think
writing the book?
a couple of things that I would comment, because I think that technically, on the writing side of that, I think that as you begin a book and you lay out the outline of, kind of, here's the basic story and here's where the content pieces are going to go in terms of writing a parable, um, that ends up always evolving somewhat, because you think of a tweak that's going to make it a little bit more of an entertaining story. You think of a tweak to make it
Mhm.
that much more memorable in terms of the content and the way you're going to phrase something. So what you start with is never what you finish with. And hopefully what you finish with is far better, because you get better along the way. What I personally have taken from writing each book is, I think, the most important thing that leaders end up doing when they share ideas or insights or information with their teams is, I learned to be a better consumer of the information that I was sharing. I think I do a pretty good job as a speaker and facilitator of cooking some good stuff. And a lot of times in writing and in reading and going back through, you begin to kind of eat your own cooking, and you begin to take your own advice. And that idea of, you do well what you do often. I'm a better writer now than I was when I first started the first book a long time ago. But I think I'm also a better leader and husband and coach and whatever else, because the more you're exposed to great ideas, the more you begin to implement, and the more comfortable you get being consistent in implementing those and being aware of things that you didn't always do as well as you knew you could have.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because I'm trying to do more writing, staying consistent, and what I love about the writing process, it's very therapeutic for me.
Mhm.
It's one of those rare things where I can get lost in really that flow of just kind of just giving yourself over to it. Nothing else is coming to mind. I'm like working on a paragraph, working on an idea. But you're right. There's so much that you can get from writing, just from tweaking. Um, and I think there's a subtle change, even if it's just a blog post, there's a subtle change in you when you wrap something up like that. There's
Mhm.
just something about the focus you pour into it, the organization you pour into it, the content, the ideas, the contribution you're giving to society. I mean, as small as it may be, it's a huge contribution. I think it's a piece of yourself. So I love the fact that you talk about what you take away in that fashion and how it makes you a better person in those other arenas you operate in. Father, coach, all of that.
Right.
That's amazing to hear.
And I think that writing necessarily creates clarity, right? So you're going to have all the, but to get it in print, to get it on a laptop screen, you've got to have the clarity of being able to put it into some type of order, and ordering your thoughts and getting them down through writing ends up providing, I think, so much more personal clarity, so that we can then begin to implement things that, if they were just in that cloud of our mind, don't always have the same impact.
Sean, for someone that is going to read this book, or maybe somebody that maybe doesn't think the book is for them because they don't think they're in the same field, like that whole conversation we have, maybe they don't think it applies to them, what would you say to them are the takeaways of this book? How would you paraphrase the message you want them to take away?
How to paraphrase the message to take away? I think that the single most important takeaway from staying coachable specifically is that hopefully we all recognize that wherever we are, we've reached that level of success because we were coachable in the past, because we were appreciative for and applied information and insights that we had looked for and gotten from others. And I am who I am as a leader because there have been innumerable mentors, a lot of whom didn't even know that I was learning and taking ideas from them, that have contributed to the impact I now have on others. And I think that desire for personal improvement, that we all at some point, we all become complacent, if even
Mm.
for a short time. And that idea of, are you going to commit to continuing to climb? And then when you get to the top of this mountain, one of the best things about being a leader or a teammate or somebody who is continually, kind of just consumed with wanting to be better and experience new, is to realize there's other mountains that you can then choose.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's great that we had a great season this year. It's great that we accomplished that on this project. But man, look at the challenge of the next project. And I think
Yeah.
the problems and obstacles are placed in our path because your life without problems would really be meaningless. You wouldn't enjoy. And it's the challenge of getting to know and impact and influence somebody that maybe at first you didn't get along with. It's those challenges and puzzles that people and projects present to us that hopefully inspire us to want to stay coachable, to want to climb that next mountain, to want to get over that next difficulty. And I think that sometimes when we get beyond the arrogance of thinking that we don't need help, then that humility of then realizing we're going to benefit from asking for and applying help from others who may have already gone down that path successfully can provide us. And so, yes, certainly that idea of, staying coachable is about wanting to continue to improve and to have better new experiences, because that's how we grow.
Yeah, I love that you bring up the fact that one of the best things is getting to that top of the mountain that you thought was the top of the mountain, and then realizing that there's another one. Um, I've said this in this podcast before, where the pandemic has shown me the power of moments, shown me the power of the journey, as opposed to just focusing on what the goal may be. Um, I don't know when it was. I mean, so much has gone on, but I just appreciate more the challenge. I appreciate more the hardships than getting to the top and then kind of looking around and saying, what's next?
Mm-hmm.
I never thought that would be the case. I think most of us go through life in school thinking we want to get to that goal, which we do obviously,
Right.
but that when we get to that goal, we'll be good. Not knowing that when we get to that goal, most of us will be like, okay, what's next? Because we don't want to be complacent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're cut from a different cloth, somebody else. But most of us are like that, where we're always looking for that next thing. We're always looking for that development, like you said, getting better
Mm-hmm.
and learning. But I love that idea that you give of, you may get to the top of this particular mountain, but you're going to realize that there's something behind that.
Yeah. And I think that that's what makes, life or careers or whatever that much more interesting and enjoyable, is the fact that, each new challenge, each new mountain, each new destination requires us to be humble again, requires us to get excited about growth again. And I think that that's where, regardless of industry, regardless of where you're at on your career path, there's always going to be that next step that's going to require you to look beyond yourself.
Sean, not to rush the authors that come on here, but what do you think is next for your writing?
Well, it's funny that you ask. I am right now in the middle of kind of putting together the outline for what I think will probably be my last book in terms of leadership stuff. But I do believe that effective leaders become effective largely because of awareness, not because of experience. And, just like we talked about early on, talent's essential, but it's never sufficient. I think
Yes.
experience is essential, but experience alone doesn't make you effective as a leader. We've all had people we worked with who have been in a position for years and aren't necessarily effective in it. I think that effectiveness comes from what have we become more aware of. And I think that ideas for leaders in terms of solving problems and being better with our staff and being better with ourselves and being better about building a system where people can thrive is what makes somebody effective. And climbing that ladder of leadership awareness is kind of what that next book I think is going to focus on.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I've always been in love with that idea of that, like the final sign that somebody is a great leader is that they can step away from an environment and nothing will change.
Right.
That it's so ingrained in that culture that
Mm-hmm.
they've created such a ripple effect that they could step away, but they've already established that mindset
Mm-hmm.
as the culture itself. I mean, culture is your world. But I love that just, yep, step away. You've done enough. You shared enough. We've taken on that knowledge, and we'll continue that work, and in most cases, legacy.
One of my favorite movies, John, is John Wayne's The Cowboys, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the idea of, this grizzled old cowboy who's got, who has to train these kids to go on a cattle drive, and he's not able to finish the cattle drive, but they're able to because of the impact that he's had in his teachings and whether personality or. I think that's, as a coach, as a parent, as a leader, our job is to make ourselves ultimately unnecessary.
Yeah, which almost seems counterintuitive,
Right.
but that I think is the true measure of a great leader. So thank you for mentioning that. Uh, Sean, in wrapping up, is there anything else you want to share? Anything that you may be up to these days that you want to put out there and share with the audience?
I have really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for asking a number of great questions and prompting me to go into some rabbit holes of sharing more than I'd anticipated. Hopefully, it's been helpful for our listeners. If they want to learn more about me or to connect with me, they can go to LinkedIn, Sean Glaze. They can find me at Great Results Team Building, and on Great Results Team Building. And I think that you mentioned you may share a link for this, but I have a whole leadership toolbox of resources that are completely free that you can access and use with your team to continue to grow your culture. And ultimately, that's the impact that I want to have with the books that I write and with the trainings and the team building and the keynotes that I share, is how can I help leaders and teams be better?
Yeah, rabbit holes is kind of one of my things, Sean. I don't want to just come on here and just ask about the book and,
Right.
what's on page 10, what's on page 30, what do you hope people take? I want to learn about the author. I want to learn about their ups, their downs, what went into their career. It started off mostly it started off mostly as, yes, wanting to talk about books, but I realized just the power of hearing your stories, what
Oh,
you're all about, and how you come to that point where you're like, you know what, I'm going to put together a book. It's almost like entranced me just thinking about someone's coming up in their career, in their life, and then just the lessons that they took from their life, how they pour it into the books they write, or what they take away from books that they're sharing that they haven't written. So rabbit holes is my thing, Sean. So I appreciate for you. I appreciate that you were able to indulge me on those.
oh, absolutely enjoyed it. And I honestly, that's one of the things that I'll share with leaders, John, and something that it was, again, a hard one lesson for me with my teams later, was the idea that it's in those rabbit holes, it's in those connecting conversations that have nothing to do with content that you become a better leader. And I think that if leaders were to invest time and really to commit time in those one-on-one meetings being more personal than just professional, in making sure that you did allow yourself to be curious to learn more about somebody's story, the empathy that you establish there has such an incredibly positive impact on the outcomes that you and your team enjoy.
Great quotes all around. We gotta, they just keep coming. Sean, I really appreciate your time and thank you for sharing on your book, Staying Coachable, a story with 4 questions to help you thrive in change and enjoy relentless improvement. Yeah, thank you for sharing your story and everything that went into this book and your other books as well.
My pleasure, John. Thank you so much for having me.
And if there's anything that I might have missed, anything that I should have asked, I've kept Sean on here for an hour, but it seems like it was only 10 minutes and I could keep going with the questions. If there is anything that I might have missed, let me know and I'll shoot Sean an email just to see what else he might be able to provide. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you for taking this journey with me, watching and listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.